let me welcome all of our speakers here today. I too would like to pick up where Ambassador Brix left off with a few words of introduction about the themes and structures of this conference. Why have we organized things the way we have? And in so doing, I will try and bring out some of the connections between then and now, between 1919 and 1929, because it seems to me that our aim ought to be to do precisely that, to, as Frederick Jackson Turner put it, to show the present to itself by revealing its origin in the past. Now, at the very beginning, I have to say, what are we not going to do? What are we not going to focus on? And the first thing may come as a surprise to many of you. We are not going to focus overly on the most famous of the treaties of 1919. That is to say, the Versailles Treaty and the settlement with Germany, which is the subject of almost all accounts. This was, of course, an important short-term concern. And for many of us, particularly the Greeks, I suppose, we can look at contemporary Germany and see it as problematic in the state system. But it seems to me that the German problem as it existed in the 19th century, the German problem as it existed in the 20th century, is of little contemporary relevance. In other words, I see little need to refight those old historiographical battles which are now largely of antiquarian interest. You mentioned the baleful influence of John Maynard Keynes and the economic consequences of the peace. This has meant that we received endless student essays year after year arguing that because the powers were beastly to the Germans, the Second World War happened. So I think we should sidestep Versailles and focus on some other things. There's a second issue that I wish we could spend more time on, and this was the question of how the conference treated Asia, the Pacific, the Far East, and above all, China. When we look at this century, from 1919 to 2019, we see the remarkable return of China to the system. And I deliberately use the return rather than rise because it seems to me that's what it was. A few weeks ago, we commemorated the 70th anniversary of the foundation of the PRC. It seems to me by the time China joined the WTO, it was integrated into a Westphalian state system. But there's a second very important strain here, which was China's reaction to the humiliation inflicted upon it by the Paris Peace Conference. And that's the May 4th movement. And the May 4th movement casts a very, very long legacy. This year is also the 30th anniversary of Tiananmen, the demonstrations and the massacres there. And the students in Tiananmen Square quite explicitly saw themselves as the heirs of May 4. And if we look at what's going on in Hong Kong today, here too, the young students in Hong Kong see themselves as the heirs of this tradition that began in 1919, this quest for freedom and self-determination. Alas, these are two big issues that we are not going to focus on. Instead, before lunch, we're going to focus on two key areas of the state system that remain of great interest to us. The first is the question of Central and Eastern Europe and the fate of the Habsburg Monarchy. The second is the Greater Middle East and the fate of the Ottoman Empire. The Habsburg Monarchy, as we all know, had been the great multinational and cosmopolitan organizing principle for world order in this part of the world. As A.J.P. Taylor famously put it, this was a solution here that would be neither German nor Russian. This great multinational and cosmopolitan structure, organizing principle, was swept away by the First World War. Now, if we look at the international state system in this part of the world now, we can say that with one important exception, we have systemic stability here. There is an equilibrium in the state system in Central and Eastern Europe. That stability is based in large part on the emergence of 19th century style ethno-nationalist entities. These 19th century style ethno-nationalist entities are those who make up our jolly little neighborhood. We have the Hungary of Orban, the Czech Republic of Babiš, the Poland of Kaczynski, and dare I say, the Austria of Sebastian Kurz. And I think the important thing is to realize how this systemic stability came about. It is the product of war, of genocide, of ethnic cleansing, of the expulsions of populations, of shifts in borders. In other words, this is the product of enormous human suffering in the bloodlands of the 20th century. But we have this systemic stability today. The exception, of course, is Ukraine. Because in the case of Ukraine, a lid was kept on the system there by the persistence of the Soviet Union and the persistence of the bipolar system. And once that system began to disintegrate, the conditions emerged for the reemergence of a Ukrainian nationalism and a crack in the system there. Hence, we have violence in the East, and of course, the great case of Grand Theft Crimea. And Grand Theft Crimea is much more than a question of Russia and Crimea. As a principle of a major state seizing part of another state, this is a regression to the pre-1945 system of international law and organization. Now, what happens if we turn our gaze eastwards and look to the greater Middle East? Here we have the question of the fate of the Ottoman Empire. And this, too, was the great organizational principle of this part of the world. This great multinational cosmopolitan empire, which, too, is going to be swept away by the First World War. One can argue that great violence began here first, in a way as harbingers of what would happen later in Central and Eastern Europe. We have the genocide of the Armenians and other Christians. We have the terrible ethnic cleansing and violence and shifting of populations in the wars between the Greeks and the Turks. But in the Ottoman Empire, an external order was soon reimposed. This was through the reassertion of the old empires, this time with a nod to Woodrow Wilson in the form of mandates under the League of Nations. And this system continued through the years of the bipolar Cold War. The great unraveling in the world of the Ottoman Empire has begun in the 21st century. We might mention the US invasion of Iraq and the Arab Spring, their revolutions of 1848 moment. But what we see now and have seen in recent years is war, genocide, ethnic cleansing, population expulsions, shifting of borders, etc., etc. In other words, the processes that happened in Central and Eastern Europe in the 20th century are repeating themselves now in the world of the former Ottoman Empire. If I may quote the very last line of Sean McMeekin's 2015 book, he wrote, "Outside Turkey's borders, the war of the Ottoman succession rages on with no end in sight." And that's true 4 years later. And in my view, a Middle East without Christians is as impoverished as a Central Europe without Jews. So we are looking at a colossal failure now of international politics, which in my opinion calls the whole system into question. Now after lunch, we will turn to a different set of questions, which are competing visions of world order that emerged through the systemic breakdown of the First World War. And each of these visions of world order has a very checkered history. They have ups and downs throughout the past century. I want to begin in 1917, because 1917, in many respects, is the structural turning point in the First World War. In the first sense, it's because it's the entry of the United States into the war. And this, of course, will determine its ultimate outcome. The United States in 1914 was a debtor nation. In 1918, it is a great creditor nation. So enter the United States. At the same year, we get exit Russia. And we get not only exit Russia, we get the transformation of Russia into the Soviet Union. These are two fundamental structural facts, and they present two rival visions of international order. For Woodrow Wilson, this was a war to make the world safe for democracy. For Lenin, this was the expression of imperialism as the highest stage of capitalism. And these two structures and these two ideologies form the core of the great duel which would dominate the 20th century. Now, it's quite amazing to reflect on the trajectory of American power in this past century. The President of the United States in 1917, Thomas Woodrow Wilson, was the only American president to have earned the doctoral degree. The President of the United States in 2019 is Donald Trump, a self-described stable genius. I think Adam Tooze, on the occasion of Trump's inauguration in 2017, published an article called "The End of the American Century." The End of the American Century. And I think I know what he meant. In other words, America will remain a great power. It will remain a powerful state. But something has changed. Something has come. Trump may leave office, but something has been broken. It's difficult for me to imagine an American foreign policy that we can return to the status quo anti-Trump. The Russian trajectory is also fascinating. Lenin's Russia, then Soviet Union, was a pariah state. It was a pariah state that pursued subversive policies and had a subversive ideology. And the world was chock-a-block of Lenin verstehers here and there. And this was seen as something that would undermine the established order. If we look at Putin's Russia, it's much diminished, of course, in power terms with respect to the Soviet Union. It punches above its weight, however. But here, too, we see remarkable subversive policies, and above all, a fascinating subversive ideology which carries a different sign to Marxist-Leninism, but is equally effective in undermining establishment values and policies. I think current analysts now are trying to study the ideologies of the emerging authoritarians, and they call this a fluid ideology because it's able to adapt so quickly. But it seems to me that the single most important vision of world order to come out of all of this was the idea of collective security. The idea that mankind could get out of the binds of an anarchic state system, could transcend the balance of power, could avoid automatic recourse to war. In other words, the idea that international law and organization would provide a way out. And the embodiment of this idea, which is born at this time, of course, is that of the League of Nations and its system. The League of Nations, for a long time, got a very bad rap. Here, I would cite the baleful influence of Edward Hallett Carr, and in a way, the hegemony of realists in international relations thinking, which greatly diminished it. In recent years, a new generation of historians is reappraising this and giving us new views of the significance of all of this. And we're lucky to have two exponents of that school here with us today. In any case, despite all of the setups, in 1944, in 1945, the architecture of international order was reinvented. And this creative phase between 1944 and the early 1950s, all of the great institutions which have characterized international politics ever since are created. First and foremost, the United Nations and its system of international law. Secondly, the Bretton Woods institution and all of the economic institutions. Thirdly, on a regional basis, the European Union and the movement towards European integration. Later, in security terms, the creation of NATO. As a formula for domestic political economy, the idea of the welfare state. This is the architecture of the liberal international world that we've been living with for 70-some years. And I think, as everybody knows, this architecture is showing its strains. And the question is, can this architecture be reformed? Should this architecture be replaced? Or, fearfully, will this architecture crash and crumble into chaos? Now, I want to end my reflection on 1919 and 2019 by mentioning the Kurds, because while we meet, this issue is happening. In 1919, the Kurds were gravely betrayed by a great power and left to the brutal mercies of their neighbors. In 2019, the Kurds have been betrayed by a great power, the United States of America, and left to the mercies of their neighbors. They have shown a remarkable resilience and courage in this past century. So I have no doubt that this is the end of the show. But one has to ponder the pictures in the New York Times this morning of boys who have been subject to white phosphorus, to ethnic cleansing that's taking place in northern Syria, and to the statement by President Erdogan on Saturday that he will crush the heads of the Kurds. That's the BBC translation. So it seems to me that the problems of world order, the problems of justice that were raised in Paris in 1919 have been by no means solved. And to paraphrase Lenin, What is to be done? What is to be done? The lessons of Paris 1919 still need to be learned. And my message to the students of the Diplomatic Academy is, my God, you have your work cut out for you. Thank you.